Welcome to the studio. My name's Andrew Tischler, but you can call me Tish. In this video, this full demonstration, I want to show you how to paint a pine tree. And I'm going to make this beginner friendly. Now, I'm making this video and sharing it with you because of the sheer amount of correspondence, messages, emails, comments that I've received asking for beginner friendly content. So it's high time I brought you something beginner friendly. In this demonstration, we're going to be painting a pine tree. I'm going to break down my materials. I'm going to talk to you as I change my brush and create different color mixes on the palette and what exactly I am mixing to achieve these colors. But let me share with you the inspiration behind this painting. Here's my photographic reference. Now you're going to notice something right away. It's a pretty bad photo, isn't it? This was just shot with an iPhone as I was barreling down the highway. I was doing it safely, of course. But as I took this photograph, you'll see clearly that road in frame. And so this is just a pine tree that's growing on a little bit of a ledge that's above a dug out berm, if you will, where they cut the road into the side of the hill. And that pine tree is just growing and it's isolated here against a really nice snow-capped mountain. Now, what I've done is I've cropped this image. So now it looks like this. And this is exactly what I'm referring to here in this demonstration. Now, this is the first part to our painting trees course, and there's lots of other demonstrations on a myriad of tree species and even some bigger painting projects where I'll break down some of these techniques in more detail. But here, for nothing, free of charge, here you've got the full demonstration on how I paint a pine tree. Now, I'm going to be talking to you and walking you through each and every one of my techniques as we go. So follow along, feel free to pause the video, take some notes if you have to, maybe even give this thing another watch. But it is my absolute pleasure to share with you this demonstration on painting a pine tree. Enjoy. Now I'm using the finest quality handmade oil color. These are Blue Ridge oils made in North Carolina. And I used an assortment of colors arranged around my palette like you see here in chromatic order. I'm using burnt umber, raw sienna, titanium white, Hansa yellow, cadmium red light, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, cobalt teal, and phthalo green. And you can see those colors there on your screen. I'm also going to be using Liquid Original and Liquid Impasto as my medium. I'm also going to be using some different kinds of brushes that you might not be familiar with. Here we've got extra long filberts. I've got a number 2 and a number 4. I'm also using a 5/8 of an inch bristle dagger brush. This one's called the Tish Dagger. I'm using a 1/4 inch bristle dagger brush. And I'm also using a synthetic round, a Shiraz number 2. Now, all of these brushes are available from rosemaryandco.com. I'm working on linen that's taped to an MDF board. This is pre-primed, and I've covered this with what's called an imprimatur. We're going to start off by sketching up our scene, and I'll explain more about the preparation of the board here in a second. But let's go ahead and sketch up our tree according to that reference material. And the combination that I'm using here is burnt umber and quinacridone magenta. Now this forms a bit of a burgundy color, equal parts burnt umber to magenta, and I'm mixing in just a touch of Liquid Original. I'm starting to sketch the outline of my tree with the Shiraz number 2 round. Now, I don't like to draw with charcoal or a pencil. If you want to take a more careful approach, by all means, you can do that. But I find that drawing with a brush really helps me with my overall drawing ability. The more I do this and throw myself in the deep end and try to draw it freehand, I find that it hones my brushwork. It really helps me see those bigger shapes, and I don't get bogged down in those unnecessary details. What we want here is the general overall feeling of the tree, its shape, a little bit of its character, and how it sits in place in the overall field of view. Now, I'm not focused much on composition with this type of painting. We're just going to be painting a pine tree. The idea of this exercise is that we could take this pine tree and drop it into a landscape. We're more or less creating a study. And so I press very lightly. Notice how far back on the brush I am. It's just a few lines needed to get an overall sense of the arrangement on the page. Now let's switch it up. Let's change our brush. Here I'm going to be using a 5/8 of an inch bristle dagger, the Tish dagger. We're going to get a little bit of liquid out on that brush. And I'm going to mix into this now some ultramarine blue and burnt umber. Your umber and ultramarine blue will go together to make a neutral near black. And I've added just a touch of quinacridone magenta to this. This will help me coordinate with that initial SketchUp color. What I'm going for here is a dark tone. And we're going to map out the mass and the darkness here in the tree first. So here, I'm just going to establish our pine tree as a dark shape on my primed linen. Now, by the way, this linen that I get, you can use canvas, but as long as it's pre-primed and then it's covered with a colored ground. This is called the imprimatura. I use a color that's a combination of burnt sienna and burnt umber. I mix oil paint with a little bit of Gamsol. You can use pure gum turpentine. If you can stand the smell, you can also use mineral turpentine. And I create a bit of a stain. Now, I add just a little bit of liquid to this as well. I coat that board and then I rub this back thoroughly with a rag. I let it dry completely before I start my painting. Now here, what we're trying to establish is the overall shape of the pine tree. But notice how I'm not cutting a precise edge. I'm not focused on detail, but I'm using the shape of the brush to suggest the different branches that we can see in this pine tree. I work that color downwards, and I've gotten even a little more blue into my mix, creating a slight green tinge. Now, the burnt umber and ultramarine blue, this is my equivalent to black. You'll notice there's no black on the palette at all. I haven't found a need for it in the last 20 years of painting. It's incredibly versatile. If I use a little more ultramarine, I can push it into a little bit more of a blue zone. If I add a bit more umber, it creates a bit more warmth. I've also snuck in there a little bit of cobalt teal as well. You'll get to know these colors the more you use them, but I feel pretty confident in saying you can mix just about anything with this arrangement. Normally I'll have cadmium lemon on the palette rather than Hansa yellow, but that Hansa yellow is nice and warm and it will give me some really lovely pine green notes when it comes to painting those highlights on our pine tree. So step one, after sketching up our scene, is to just establish that dark shape. I think that's sitting there pretty well. In this exercise, we're really learning how to see this pine tree and learning where to bend the image and break the rules, so to speak. I don't need to do a perfect copy of this photograph, but what I'm going for is the overall character. You might notice that I've missed out a few branches here and there. It really is not important, as long as I've got the overall main character of the tree. That's the main thing. Okay, let's change up our brush. This time I'm going to be picking up an extra long filbert number 4, and let's start working on the background. We've established the dark shape of our tree, and so now we need to make sure that sky really goes back into space, and you'll notice in your reference that it's pretty light. There's a bit of overcast quality to the sky, and we've got some light that's shining through those clouds, but I want to keep the background pretty suggestive. Now, ultramarine blue and burnt umber go together to make that neutral black as we've discussed, and I'm also using the white now to lift the tone or lift the value. So much about painting has to do with value. We're going to talk a lot about that in this course, and particularly in this demonstration. It's a very light value back here, or a light tone. If I use too much titanium white at this stage, I'm going to create a chalky mess. So I hold back with that white. As long as it's just enough there to create this light gray, we're on the right track. Now, the ratio of medium to paint is 1 part medium to 3 parts paint. I'm just adding little bits of liquid to my mixes to increase and improve the flow, but this will also aid with the drying time. One of the criticisms of oil paint, often people don't like using it because it's so slow drying, but the liquid original really helps us get around this. This painting will be dry the very next day, and there will even be an opportunity for us to layer over the top of some of that dried brushwork. It makes oil painting super convenient and fast. Now I've dropped the tone, as you can see here, achieving a slightly darker gray. And notice how I'm bringing this darker gray in to meet that lighter gray that we had established before. And I'm drawing across this boundary, creating a little bit of mottling and brushwork between one lighter gray and a slightly darker one, creating a bit of a painterly effect. Preserve some of that brushwork and keep that in there. It creates a nice look. After all, we're not doing a copy of a photo here, we're creating a painting. It's vitally important that as you mix color, you preserve area in your palette. So you'll notice that there's a particular layout to my color, and here I keep to this order. Now, even though I might add some more yellows, reds, maybe a few more blues and some greens and earth colors, it sticks to this order. The organization on the palette is key, but you also want to preserve plenty of mixing space on your palette. Mixing color is not just about creating one pile of paint and trying to affect change in that one pile. You want to make a mix and then keep it there on the palette. Remember, with the Liquid Original, you've got a little bit of working time. So in one sitting, that paint is going to be perfectly workable for the next 6 to 10 hours. Now, ideally, you want to knock out a painting like this in about 2 to 3 hours. And that's about the time it took me to create this painting. But here in this demonstration, we're going to show you every mix and every brush stroke. You'll notice that there's a little bit of variation to these grays in the sky above. And here I'm applying a bit of a darker shadow below one of these clouds that's coming in from overhead, and then I'm blending slightly between strokes. This extra long bristle filbert picks up and carries a bit of paint, but I continually go back to that palette and reload my brush. Now you might be wondering why use the color that I've chosen for the underground imprimatura. This is an old master's technique. This adds warmth to my colors, and it starts to show through in gaps in the brushwork. But in thin areas, like you can see in the sky over towards the left-hand edge, there's a beautiful warmth that starts to come through. This ties all of our colors together, creates some color harmony, but adds a punch of vibrance to it as well. For the most part, our landscape is dominated by greens and blues. And so I've chosen a color here that is the complementary opposite of a lot of the colors that we're going to be applying over the top. Even with this gray, there's enough ultramarine in there and enough of a coolness to this color that the warm of the undertone of that imprimatura against the cool of the colors that we're applying over the top, it creates this vibration. That's what we want. We want to create an interesting surface, and you'll get that old master's look if you try this technique and you're applying some of the things that you're seeing here. Now I'm applying that paint, bringing it all the way to the edge of the pine tree, and I'm starting to define the shape a little bit more by bringing the sky in. And by continually reloading my brush, I'm not picking up so much of that underlying darker color from establishing the pine tree itself. But you must reload your brush continually. Now, one thing that the beginner struggles with is that color coordination. You'll notice that there's going to be a common element coming throughout each and every mix. We're going to be using a lot of ultramarine, a lot of burnt umber, cobalt teal, and quinacridone magenta, and virtually everything that we apply here. And because everything's made up of the same stuff, it ends up coordinating. The sky ends up talking to the tree. There's a link between the two, and the tree sits firmly in the landscape. As you'll see when we flesh this out with some fresh paint, it'll be the same colors yet again. It's just the ratios change. If color coordination is something that you struggle with in your painting, then try this. Limit the amount of color that you get out on the palette. And if you're going to paint blue in your sky, like we're mixing up here of cobalt teal and ultramarine blue with a touch of quinacridone, if you're going to paint that sky, make sure it's got the same sort of blue that you're using elsewhere in your painting. Now I want to have a little bit of this sky blue poking through a gap in the clouds, just as I'm seeing in the reference photo. I'll paint this in this gap that I've left, showing in the sky here, high to the right. And as I brush this through, I feather it into the edge of that gray that we had previously established. Now, it's not too important the size of the painting that I'm working on here. This is around an A3 sheet, somewhere around 10 inches by 14 inches. But whatever size you feel comfortable with, just follow along with this process. Again, it's just a size that I could fit onto my board, and I've taped the edge of the painting here with masking tape. One thing I was careful about, however, is making sure that my edges were nice and straight and that I had a right angle, top and bottom. So on each and every corner, it was an exact 90-degree angle. This might help me if I want to frame it later on. So I've mapped in the blue of my sky. I've feathered across the edge ever so slightly, trying to create a little bit of nice brushwork up here in the top reaches of our painting. Now, texture might be an important thing as you're painting along. You'll want to be thinking about a little bit of body to your paint. Of course, using more volume and more paint out on your brush will help with this, but I also have that impasto medium right there. Now, the impasto medium is going to help me retain brush marks and brush texture. It's going to preserve all of those peaks on the strokes that I'm applying. It's a little bit different to the liquid original, but it does dry incredibly fast. In fact, it dries even faster than the liquid original. You'd think being thicker that it might dry slower. This just isn't the case. It dries very fast and it will keep all of that brushwork. So I'll apply a little bit of this where I want some thicker strokes. Generally, I like to keep the background and the distance relatively thin and increase that texture on areas of brighter tone or lighter value and areas where we might have some sun highlights, maybe across the fronts of some of those pine needles that are picking up a direct highlight. So I keep my shadows relatively thin, but some of those light areas I might make a bit thicker. Now let's start bringing these background mountains forward. And you'll notice here, I'm making this a bit bluer and a little bit darker, working along the edge of that sky. Here, up in the high reaches of our landscape, we've got a bit of snow. And as that cloud passes overhead and the snow is in shadow, it's going to have a slight blue tinge. This is something I'm seeing pretty clearly in the photograph. I'll work a little bit of this blue, very similar to the blue of the sky, but with just a little more umber, start working it downwards. We'll get even lighter as it emerges out into the light. Now, there's something in particular I'm trying to achieve with my paintings. Trying to capture that sense of realism. I want this to feel real, but at the same time, I want it to also look like a painting. It's a bit of a balancing act. From a distance, you'll be able to feel that it's a pine tree. You'll be able to feel that light that's cutting across this landscape and illuminating this tree. But when you get up close to it, I want the viewer to be able to appreciate the brushwork and all those individual marks that went together to make this landscape. It's not about blending everything into oblivion and creating a really smooth, slick surface. You want to be able to see some of those marks. So to achieve better marks, we continually reload that brush. And I'm also focused on the nature of the stroke. I'm not making marks generally that are any longer than twice the length of those bristles. I also continually change the direction of the stroke. This also helps create a bit more interest. You can see the landscape already starting to come forward. Now, what I'm trying to do with realism is I'm trying to achieve a sense of form, depth, light, and material. And this is really all you have in realist painting. So you have a sense of form, or another way of putting that is shape with volume. I want to be able to feel the three-dimensionality of shapes, be it the shape of the clouds, the landscape in the background, and the tree. Right now, all we have is a flat shape for our tree, but in order to build that form, we're going to have a bit of highlight come through on one side, and also start to poke windows in the tree itself. But to create depth, this really is something that I'm really focused on. I want that background landscape to feel so much further away than the tree, to really push it back into the distance. The light is going to be a bit of a trick, but we'll talk about that when it comes time to apply those highlights. And then the material. This is making your clouds feel like clouds, like they're the actual material of water vapor hanging in that atmosphere, and feeling the texture and quality of those pine needles. And how do we do this without detailing each and every needle? So this demonstration is going to be focused on that, how to capture form, depth, light, and material. And it doesn't matter if I'm painting a vase of flowers, a landscape with mountains, or a portrait. This is my primary concern, is capturing realism, which is all of those four things working in unison. Now, it's all well and good having that as a checklist and having a desire to capture form, depth, light, and material, but how do we actually do it? Well, the basis of my teaching is controlling those things that I do have right there at my fingertips. And this is another four things. I hope you're taking notes. All I have to manipulate to capture realism is a sense of line and shape. Also, I have my tonal values. I have color, and I also have the quality of edge, how one shape meets another, and that's it. So that is 1, line and shape, otherwise known as my drawing. 2, my tonal values, how light and dark something is. I have color. This could be referring to the saturation or chroma, how intense that color is, how muted the color is, what hue it is. Are we talking about a yellow, a red, or a blue? And then I have the way one brushstroke meets another. Is it a sharp edge, or is it a slightly blended or diffused edge? Now, don't get overwhelmed here. It's really simple. Just that first four things is all I have to play with. Line and shape, tonal values, color, and edge. And this all goes together to create that realism that we're talking about. So I'm going to talk to you in terms of those first four. Where did we start this painting? Well, we started with our drawing, sketched up with our synthetic Shiraz number 2. And then I started thinking about those values. You'll notice that we blocked in first our tree with a very dark shape, creating a dark value to bring that tree forward, but it didn't really sit in place until we added that light sky behind. Now, oftentimes, I'll paint in some of those darks first, and then work with whatever's furthest away and bring the scene forward. With some of my bigger studio work, I'll just start immediately with whatever's furthest away and just come tier of depth by tier of depth and just bring that forward from background to midground to foreground. You can take whatever approach, but here I suggest for this initial demonstration, if you're just starting out and you're a beginner, try following along with what I've done here. But now that I have my drawing, I'm thinking about value. I'm thinking how light that background needs to be. Now, I don't want to go too far and use too much white, even though I can see a lot of brightness back here. After all, we want to use that color. We don't want to have things go too chalky. Too much titanium white, trying to add too much light, will just create a bit of a mess. So you can really overdo that titanium white. I suggest adding a little touch of burnt umber and ultramarine blue to your white to just knock it back into a gray note. But you'll notice something here with our values. They get slightly darker in the shadows as we come forward. Now we have some trees that are growing on this distant slope here, and you'll notice that these areas got a bit darker as we started to move towards the viewer. Here I'm adding in a bit more ultramarine blue, and I'm also adding in some cobalt teal. But there's also plenty of burnt umber in this mix. Now, the burnt umber has a tendency to counteract the intensity of the color of our blue. Our blue, when used just by itself, we would call this saturated. It's high chroma. It hasn't been tainted with much of anything else if we're adding it pure out of the tube. This can sit out of place if we don't mix it with other colors. So I knock it back with just a little bit of burnt umber. This grays it out a little bit, but it makes the color less intense. It also has the effect of making things darker, which is what we want in those shadows as we move forward. And so I deepen this mix. The further I come forward, the more blue I'm adding, but I'm also ensuring to add just a touch more burnt umber as I come forward, dropping the tone or reducing the value, lowering that value, making it darker as we move towards the viewer. Now, the raw sienna has been very handy in adding those highlights far beyond. We've got some grass and some various species of trees and shrubs growing on those distant slopes. Now, we know that grass is green and we know that the trees are also green. But you'll notice that I have not yet added my phthalo green or Hansa yellow yet to achieve the green that I know is up there. You might have heard before, paint what you see, not what you know. Well, I know that that grass has got some intensity to that color, especially if I got right up to it and looked at it, picked some out of the ground and held it in my hand. I would observe that this is indeed very green grass, but it's at such a distance away from the viewer that we need to knock that color back. After all, we're trying to achieve depth. So paying attention to what light does and what color does in the landscape at an enormous depth away from the viewer, this is going to be important. So what do? I knock back the chroma or the saturation. So I'm using a very dull yellow, mixing this in with my ultramarine and lifting out the tone with white. It's almost slightly brownish as I apply some of these strokes, but there's just enough green here that it's starting to appear like some of that grass between gaps in our trees. Now at the moment, it just looks like a bit of a random pattern. We'll bring this into a clearer focus as we progress with our painting. Now I start off pretty general. The image overall is slightly out of focus or diffused. This is my block-in. And so this is my chance to establish the composition, my overall arrangement, and create a general framework for the painting that's about to unfold. I keep things nice and loose and general in the beginning, and I work on that resolve as I near completion. We can jump out of the gates right away with extreme detail, but oftentimes what happens is we get bogged down in that detail, only to find that we might have to shift things later on or make adjustments with our colors. It's far better to start off general and work your way towards that specific detail once we have our big shapes locked in. If our big shapes are in place and it's working in a general sense, we stand a better chance of this working in detail, focused. I'm applying a few mid-tone shadows, so not too dark, but also not too light. Just trying to communicate the way that this bank is eroded. Now you'll remember from our discussion on the photographic reference, this bank, as I've cropped it, you can just see the top edge of it. It almost feels a bit natural, even though this was carved out of the landscape by a digger. Still, I think those furrows that are left in the earth here as they've been eroded away provide a bit of interest that leads our eye upwards into the tree. That said, this is just going to be a study of a pine tree in a landscape. We're not going to spend too much time with this landscape, but it is important to have some context for our tree to exist in. So let's talk a little bit about value or tone. Now I'll use both of those words and mix it up between those two. So whenever I'm talking about tone, I'm referring to how light or dark something is. And again, value, same thing. It's just referring to how light or dark something is. So with our shadows, the darkest shadows are going to come further forward. This is one way that we can use paint to create that illusion of three-dimensional space. If I applied these dark shadows in our trees out in the distance with our mountain, it would come too far forward. It's the difference between these tones in the pine tree here and those trees beyond that creates that sense of depth. So preserve your darkest tones, your darkest values, for the immediate foreground. This tree I would consider in the immediate foreground, so naturally it must be darker. I'm going to go over the pine tree once more with this broad bristle brush. This is my dagger, 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to work the edge of the distant mountain into the tree slightly. I want to solidify our pine tree a little bit more before moving on to these blank spots that have been left with that imprimatura showing through. So I start working over this, creating that sunlight that's glancing across this bank that's being eroded. Notice here how I'm using a little bit of raw sienna and burnt umber mixed with titanium white. And I've got just a little bit of liquid impasto coming through. Now, by the way, if I forgot to mention, the ratio of medium to paint is 1 part medium to 3 parts paint, regardless if I'm using liquid original or liquid impasto. At this ratio, I'm pretty much guaranteed to have a dry painting by the very next sitting, and I can carry on with the same painting the next day without lifting any of that underlying color. Now you'll notice how in the initial drawing stage, we were creating zones. These are our big shapes. And here, I'm just working from zone to zone, bringing those edges together. I will blend slightly across those edges, and that's for a particular reason. When we're applying thick strokes of paint, you get what's called ridge lines. These are furrows that are left in the wet paint, similar to a plow going through a farmer's field, creating big grooves in the landscape. Our brushwork can apply similar grooves in the wet paint. But around the boundaries of our big shapes, these edges can be quite distracting. You want to make sure you blend slightly across some of these edges to just flatten them out a little bit before they meet each other. When we go over the top of this dried block-in layer, it'll help us in creating a bit of detail. And one thing I like to do with my paintings is keep my options open. Too much heavy, distracting texture across edges can hold me back if I was to paint some individual blades of grass or weeds that are catching that direct sunlight, for instance. So I just flatten down some of these edges before moving on from this pass. Now the colors I'm predominantly using here are burnt umber, raw sienna, and that titanium white. But you'll notice there's a slight cold gray quality to some of the shadows. This is because I've been sneaking in there a little bit of the ultramarine blue. Notice how I've been working here at the edge of that initial dark tone that we had applied for our tree. This slight amount of ultramarine is all I need to adjust the temperature of my shadow, shifting it cooler. Now, a lot of the block-in layer, it's all about establishing that shape. So it's okay to just paint areas out as a single block. We can come back later and add some details. Now, the more raw sienna and white, and even a little bit of Hansa yellow, will create a bit of warmth. I'll have a bit more warmth coming out here across the top lip of our exposed bank. Eventually, here, we're going to have some dry grass that's going to be really nicely highlight against that deeper shadow. But for now, we're just going to cover up some of that imprimatura that's showing through. And as we establish our shapes, and the more of that imprimatura that we cover, the more you can see this image is starting to emerge. Notice how simple it is in terms of its shapes, and how we've brought all those edges together. Now we need to apply some more texture with our 1/4 inch bristle dagger brush. Now here, while the paint is still wet, I can draw across this boundary with that dried brush, flicking it upwards into the wet, dark paint, creating a bit of that grass texture. Now there's some other specialty brushes that we can use to create more grass-like texture, but we'll talk about that as we go along. Now I decide to reestablish a little bit of that dark shape, working once again across that boundary, and flatten out some of these areas of brushwork. Now what we're going to do is mix up a bit of lighter color, working with a similar color that we had established previously with our sky. I'm going to mix some white into a bit of that lighter blue mix that we had previously, and some liquid impasto. And because of the amount of white that I'm using, we're going to be reflecting a bit more light back to that viewer. I want to create some of these highlights of the snow that's fallen high up in our mountain. Now, the thing I love about the bristle dagger brush, and here, this is a Tisch dagger. Yes, it was named after me. I really love this brush. It's made by Rosemary & Co., and I love its versatility. We can create really nice edges with this brush as we draw it along, but we can also just twist the handle and use just the point or the top corner of that brush for some finer marks. When we use the broad blade of the brush, we can blend areas and create some more bold strokes. This one brush has really sped up my technique, but it's helped me create some really interesting painterly marks. It certainly is my favorite brush to use. Now, it's not the only brush I use, as you've seen here, but it's great for adding little painterly accents here and there. I'll use this to draw across some of those wet areas of paint to create a little bit more of a lost edge effect. Now let's mix up a little bit lighter color here. This is going to be a lighter green with raw sienna, some cobalt teal, and a bit of Hansa yellow. And we're going to start to draw across the lead edge of our pine tree, creating some dull, subtle highlights. Now I'm going to be keeping this dull on purpose. It's much grayer than what I'm seeing in our photographic reference, but this is to just indicate a bit of that light shining across the lead edge of the tree. As long as I have a difference between the highlight and the shadow, it'll work. We'll certainly come back and adjust each of these areas. But simultaneously, I'm going to be grabbing a little bit of that background sky color and bring it down into the tree itself, breaking apart that solid edge a little bit more. Now, there's a thing in painting called negative space or negative shapes. This simply refers to wherever the shape that we're trying to communicate isn't. So that is to say, here we are defining our pine tree by painting our sky. I'm focused on the gaps between branches. This not only defines the branches, but it brings a little bit more sky coming in behind our tree. Rather than paint this in the initial block in, I go ahead and paint that directly over the top of our solid tree shape. Notice here how I'm using just the very point, the tip of that bristle dagger brush, dragging in some of this lighter gray and further defining the character of our pine tree. One thing I'm trying to do here is vary the size of these shapes, these little windows that I'm knocking in place. I don't want the same shape over and over again. I'm trying to avoid things that are a little bit of a mechanical pattern. I want to create something random, something that nature would do. Rarely do we see the same shape over and over and over again. And it's our tendency as human beings to create order and pattern where it wouldn't ordinarily exist. So even though I can see some relatively equidistant windows showing in my tree, I make a conscious effort to make this as random as I possibly can. So some of these shapes are going to be a little bit bigger, maybe lay down in a different orientation. And then other areas, I'll apply just a fine pinpoint of light. I start from the top of the tree and work my way downwards. And as I come down, and I'm thinking about some of those tones and colors beyond, I start deepening the gray. So adding a little more umber as I travel downwards, just paying attention to the color of that landscape beyond. Now, when we look up close, you can see there's a lot of brushwork here. That's a good thing. We want to keep some of that painterly quality coming through. I continue to feather the edge, and I remind myself to keep reloading my brush as I travel along. Now, you'll notice a particular way that I'm loading that brush. I'm grabbing bits of paint from my reservoirs around the edge of the palette, and as I mix across, I'm swishing that brush across the surface, then rolling the brush over the palette. It's happening pretty quickly. And then I pick up that fresh paint with the lead edge of those bristles. If you continue to pick up the paint over and over and over again without rolling it off your brush, you'll end up having that paint travel upwards towards the metal of the brush, called the ferrule. You'll notice that rarely does the paint actually touch the ferrule of the brush while I'm painting. I keep that paint just along those ends of the bristles. And this is only possible when I roll that paint off the brush after picking up a few loads. You roll it, it deposits a really nice little accumulation of paint there, and then you pick it up with the lead edge of those bristles. Now, even though I'm picking up quite a bit of paint, I'm still creating a relatively clean painting. It's not turning into an absolute mess. Again, this comes down to reloading your brush. Otherwise, you're going to take all of that dark tone from our pine tree and mix that straight into the sky. You might get a little bit of that dark color sneaking in here and there. A little bit is okay, but we want to avoid creating a muddy, smudgy mess. I pick up a little bit of ultramarine, a touch of cobalt teal, and some more quinacridone magenta, achieving some of those darker tones of the mountain in shade. And remember, that shade is caused by our clouds passing overhead. It's darkened this area slightly in the mountains beyond, shifted it a little bit bluer, and this is the color that I'm bringing in behind the pine tree, continuing to cut some of those windows. Now here in this particular cut of this video, you're seeing the painting progress in real time. Again, we're showing you virtually every brushstroke and every mix here in this demonstration. Less than an hour in, and our painting is already starting to take shape from just a handful of very simple techniques and easy combinations of color. I poke a few holes in the tree, bringing this technique downwards, working my way towards the base. You'll notice that the shape of my tree is slightly different than our reference material. That's okay. Rarely do I follow exactly what I'm seeing in the photograph. And in our extended tree course, you'll see me do this time and again. We're using our reference as inspiration, but we're not necessarily following it exactly. That said, you've got this reference material now with this demonstration. So if you do want to copy it verbatim, go for it. As long as you're painting, it's okay with me. You have my permission, not that you needed it. Now let's go ahead and poke a few holes in the lower right of our tree and bring in a little bit more of that pine texture. It's already starting to get a bit of that feeling to it. I deepen the blue here, adding more ultramarine, cobalt teal, and quinacridone, and also a bit of burnt umber to the mix, deepening the tone, desaturating slightly so it's not quite as intense, and this allows that mountain to carry on behind our tree. As I'm applying some of these windows to the tree, knocking these holes here and there, I'm thinking about the underlying structure of the tree itself. I'm paying attention to where branches would exit the trunk, and also thinking about where that trunk is running centrally from the base all the way up to the top. As long as these windows don't cross that median line, I should get some sort of indication about where that trunk will reside. Notice, though, we have not painted any branches or the trunk at all. We've just suggested where it might be located. Even so, we can get a sense of the structure of the tree without having painted any lines at this stage. Now let's apply some highlights. This is going to be Hansa yellow, ultramarine blue, and cobalt teal with a touch of raw sienna. This is going to be a cool, lighter highlight. Now, we want to create something that is reminiscent of these pine needles, and you'll notice that a lot of pine species, they actually have some very cool highlights. But they're not white. One of the things that the beginner will try to do when they're painting highlights generally is they'll get out too much white too quickly. What we're looking for is just a slight amount of tonal contrast. As long as this is lighter than that underlying dark that we applied previously, we'll be all right. It'll give us enough contrast to give us the indication that these pine needles are in the sunlight. But you might be wondering, isn't that dark now starting to look a little bit thin? And isn't a little bit too much of that imprimatura coming through? Well, I'm glad you noticed. I am going to come back once that underlying layer, the block end, is dry, and we'll reestablish some of those darker tones. We could do it here in this sitting as long as we had a heavily loaded brush to overcome some of that wet paint, but a lot of this technique I'll apply in the second sitting. Now, I work with a layered technique generally, and I have those 3 phases to my painting process, but you're going to see it here in just 2 phases. Now, normally, just to give you a heads up, I'll work with a block end, then apply what I call modeling, and then go ahead and apply final detail. And some of my bigger, more complicated pieces will have up to 5 to 6 layers of detail, including glazes. Now, that's a lot to chew on. But here in this demonstration, we're going to complete this painting in just 2 sittings. So here, I worked for about an hour to 2 hours in the initial sitting, and then another hour in the second sitting. I take plenty of breaks as I go, but due to the joys of editing, we were able to compress this down a little bit without cutting anything out. I simply had my editor cut out a few of those coffee breaks, which you don't need to sit through. But if you did want to take a break, just hit pause and go put the coffee on. Now here, as we're painting along, you'll notice that that lighter green is standing proud of some of those deeper shadows. Again, it's not an intense or bright highlight. It's pretty dull here at this stage. Now I want to share a concept with you that will help you bring light into your paintings. And if you're just starting out on your painting journey, then listen up. I think this will help you create some really great effects with your work. You want to save your tonal best for last. What is my tonal best? The brightest value I can achieve with this palette is pure titanium white. That's going to reflect the maximum amount of light that I can achieve here. Now, it makes good sense to hold back with that brightest tone in the initial stages. I've seen many beginners attempt to paint light by adding more and more titanium. And their paintings are getting lighter, sure, but they're also getting chalkier. The sense of light comes about through contrast. It comes about through a difference, a relationship built up with that difference between our darkest darks and those lighter lights. And again, so long as these highlights are lighter than the value that they're going over, it'll work. But here, as I'm painting along with some of these lighter pine notes, I know that I can go a little bit brighter. So working with this layering, I'm going to apply even brighter highlights over the top of some of these strokes once they're dried. So hold back in those initial stages, and then just gradually increase your value, adding a little bit more white to that mix as you progress. And I guarantee you're going to be getting more of a sense of light within your paintings. So, that saying again, save your tonal best for last. Now, as I add in some of these pine highlights, you'll notice how I'm using just the ends of the bristles. There's no need for a detail brush at this stage. If we wanted to, we could get out some finer synthetic rounds, but we might not need it in this painting. This is one way we could achieve a painterly look. Just by using the tools that we have, it takes a light touch. Just a little bit of paint on the ends of those bristles and just lightly flicking it across the surface, continually reloading that brush as we progress. You'll notice that I'll make a maximum of 6 strokes with that brush before going back to pick up more paint. Now you want to have plenty of paint to work with, and I'm often asked, do I pre-mix my colors before starting? I tend not to do this. In some cases, the situation might call for it, but generally, I mix as I go. Naturally, you might not nail the exact combination as you're traveling along, but that's okay. Slight differences in the colors that you're applying will create visual interest. After all, it's a painting, not a photo. Now, I pay very close attention to the character and quality of those highlights, and I'm trying to make the brush mimic the way the light falls across those pine needles. I'm also noticing on my photograph where those highlights occur. They're not going to occur all the way across the tree. I'm going to stay away from some of those shadow portions. Now, let's get even more detailed here. I'm going to pick up my long filbert number 2. And let's apply even finer marks. I'm going to take some ultramarine blue, some of that dark tone that we had established before. I'll make this even darker with burnt umber and ultramarine, and even add now a little bit of phthalo green and quinacridone magenta. Now here's a little pro tip for you. There's actually 2 ways that I can make black or a very dark tone with my palette. So not only the burnt umber and ultramarine, but I can also use phthalo green, magenta, and burnt umber. With my number 2 extra long filbert bristle brush, I'm using this darker, cooler, slightly bluer color to reestablish some of the darker tone of the pine. Now, this was getting a little bit too washed out, a bit too thin, and too much of the imprimatura was coming through. So I mix up plenty of paint here and apply some spots of color to darken up my pine tree, working around some of those windows that I had carved out previously. Now the painting here is still wet, so I need to continually reload that brush. But I start once again at the top of the tree, start to work my way downwards towards the base. You'll notice here that the tree is getting more and more resolved in waves from the top of the tree down towards the base. We did this with the initial block-in of our tones. We did it with cutting the edge of our tree by applying some of those background sky colors. We did that with applying the highlights. Now I'm doing it once again with these darker tones. Regardless if I started at the top or at the base of the tree, there's no right or wrong way to go about here. But what I'm doing is pushing a frontier edge, if you will, from one end of the tree to the other. So once I start off with the technique, I'll pick a particular place of the tree and travel across in a wave. And the tree, almost as if it was getting printed out here, starts to become more and more detailed, more and more resolved. Now you can work directly over the top of some of those lighter background colors and the sky. This is called direct painting. You can totally do it in the same sitting while the paint is still wet. It does work quite well when the paint's dry, but while it's still wet, you'll be picking up a little bit of that lighter color, blending across the edges slightly, and this is just going to help you create more of a painterly look. However, it is key, and I know I keep repeating this, but it's key that you continue to reload that brush. This will help you create a cleaner painting. Now this extra long filbert number 2 is all the detail brush I need for this phase. We'll get out some specialty brushes later on for a few intricate marks here and there, just applying a few accents, but most of the heavy lifting with the detail will be done with this brush. Now let me just give you that dark pine combination once again. And you'll notice how I've used a few of those other colors that are surrounding this dark mix that I keep hitting with the brush. Notice how that dark tone of our pine tree is getting more and more solidified. So here, it's the same constituents, the same ingredients in this combination, just about, as the highlights. We're getting color coordination in those deeper shadows with those highlights because we're using the same colors. So if you've ever struggled with getting your colors to sync up and feel coordinated, then try this. Coordination comes through common elements. Now notice how we're starting to fragment and break up the image a little bit more. Whilst the block-in had bigger, maybe more flat shapes, to use that word, here we're starting to break that shape just a little bit. We're starting to fragment the edge and create a bit of brushwork and interest across some of those big zones of color, all while deepening the tone of our shadow. I'm working up to the edge of some of those highlight marks, preserving those highlights, but we can come back with a little more precision and readjust and apply some brighter highlights to the lead edge of some of our pine needles. Slowly but surely, our pine tree is taking shape. Let's now apply a few more of these dark marks to the back side of the pine tree. You can see here where we've lost the edge of the pine against that distant mountain. It's appearing a little bit too hazy back here. As we darken our tone and sharpen our edge, it brings the pine tree a little bit closer towards the viewer. Now, there's a really interesting relationship between line and shape, tonal values, color, and edge, and each and every point on our list of creating form, depth, light, and material. I want to focus for a moment, though, on depth. It's the quality of our line and shape, our drawing, that creates a sense of depth. Also, our value, as we discussed, can also help aid that depth or kill it if we don't pay attention to it. Our color can create a sense of depth, but that edge quality can also create a sense of depth. Soft, diffused edges seem to travel further away from the viewer, whereas sharper edges come a bit further forward. You'll find, after you've been painting for a little while, that everything on our list, that list of 4 things, line and shape, tonal values, color, and edge, each one of those points can actually help aid that realism. And each of them plays a role in each and every point on that list. So, depth can be created by using our line and shape, our tonal values, our color, and our edge. Similarly, form can be created using line and shape, tonal values, color, and edge. Light. It's amazing how light can be created. That feeling of forms bathed in light can be created using line and shape, tone, color, and edge. And our sense of material, you guessed it, it's line and shape, tone, color, and edge that creates a sense of material. I'm juggling all of this. So if you find this overwhelming, write this down in your notebook. Write 2 lists, each list being 1 to 4, and write them side by side. So you've got 1 through 4 on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you've got 1 through 4. So on that first list, you're writing line and shape, number 1, then your tonal values, number 2, then your color, number 3, and finally your edge, number 4. And on that second list, you're going to write form, depth, light, and material. And then from your first list, draw a line to join up line and shape with form. Draw a line from line and shape to depth. Draw a line from your line and shape to light, and then draw one to material. As you make these connections, and you can go through the list making more connections, you'll realize that the first list really helps create that second list, which is our goal. Our goal, what we're trying to achieve, is a sense of form, depth, light, and material. Now, I don't know about you, but I had never heard that before, broken down in that way. And if this is new for you, we're going to expand on this much more in our full tree course. I really want you to be there for that. Make sure you're in the studio for those sessions, and we're going to paint even more trees together. Now let's carry on. This time we're going to move down to our 1/4 inch bristle dagger brush. It's the very next day. This painting is dry, and it's time to solidify the image. I'm going to apply some darker tone here. Burnt umber with phthalo green, a touch of quinacridone magenta, making as dark a color as I can muster here. And I'm going to add a touch of quinacridone and ultramarine to push this into a bluer, slightly more violet note towards the backside of this tree. Working over the top of the dried painting now, I'm not picking up any of that underlying color, so I'm able to travel a little bit faster, creating cleaner edges. It begs the question, why not just do this in the first pass? I'm glad you asked. Well, there's some benefit here to working over the dried painting, but I also really do like that look of brush strokes that are slightly blended in with one another. But here, once the painting's dried, we can really solidify and deepen that tone. Once a fresh layer of paint goes over the top of our dried block-in layer, those tones can get a little bit darker here. I've applied a touch of raw sienna to my mix to achieve a bit more of a pine green note. That shadow is getting a little bit dark. As I apply some of that raw sienna to my mix, it's bringing a little bit of lightness to it, but also shifting it a bit more yellow, a bit more reminiscent of what I'm seeing in my photographic reference. I'm trying to honor some of those windows that I had poked in the tree before, bringing in some of that distant mountain color behind my tree. And I continue to block this in and brush across that dried layer, retaining some of that brushwork. Okay, let's pick up another brush. Here, we're going to use our number 4 long filbert. Again, this is a bristle brush, and generally you'll find that bristle brushes carry a bit more paint volume than synthetic brushes. I do like to have a mix of brushes in my kit. This gives me a wide range of the types of marks that I can achieve. I've got plenty of options depending on the material that I'm trying to convey. But having a mix allows me to push and pull that surface, creating texture where it's needed, some brushwork where it's needed, and also creating that precision and detail in case the painting calls for it. I'm going to apply a little bit of this color around some of those windows that we'd achieved previously. I'm going to blend slightly across these edges. But remember, because it's the next day now, we're not picking up any of that underlying paint. Now with oil painting, you can absolutely walk away from the painting and come back at a later date. As long as every layer of my paint has got just a touch of that liquid original in there, I'm going to get what's called adhesion. You want one layer of paint sticking to the next. And a lot of the problems that we experience with oil painting are due to these layers becoming unstuck or delaminating. Another word for this is disadhesion. So when one surface adheres to another, it's sticking down. But you can imagine when it doesn't quite stick, it can lead to problems like cracking, crawling, or as I said, delamination. It can be a nightmare for a painter. But the good thing about the liquid is it has enough of a bond between layers that contain this material in there that one layer sticks really well to another, so long as I don't use too much of it. Now you might be wondering, well, with this liquid, is it going to yellow? Well, it might if I use too much, but at 1 part medium to 3 parts paint, I stand a really good chance of avoiding any yellowing decades down the track. Now, just on a side, when it comes to the yellowing of mediums, I did a little bit of a test many years ago, back in 2017. So that is nearly 10 years now from the time of making this recording. And I started my test at a ratio of 1:1, 1 part titanium white to 1 part medium. And then I just increased my medium from there. 2 parts medium to 1 part paint, 3 parts medium to 1 part paint. And at this stage, I can safely say that the 2 parts medium to 1 part paint, which is way beyond I would ever use in a painting, that has still not yellowed. So if you have inadvertently gone over the ratio, don't panic. You should be okay. But one thing is for sure, we do want one layer to stick to another, and so using just a little bit will help us with that. Now, another question I'm often asked about the medium in particular is it low toxic or no toxic? Look, there is a little bit of a fume to it, and some artists don't like it for that reason. So there are low toxic or no toxic alternatives, but they handle slightly differently. If you want to go for a low toxic option, I highly recommend Rublev Oleo Gel, but that will be a subject of another demonstration as it does handle slightly differently. You could also go solvent-free gel made by Gamblin, and this handles similar to liquid, but again, it's got slight differences, but it's a really great low fume or no fume option to be using in the studio. But I'm a liquid guy, and I love using this for its convenience and fast drying properties, because here we can go ahead and layer immediately the next day. Now, once again, I'm continuing over the top of that dried layer, and it's that accumulation of brushwork that is solidifying this image. Burnt umber ultramarine blue forms the basis of most of my dark mixes, along with that raw sienna. But if I require even more depth and even more darkness, so dropping that tone, I'll use phthalo green, quinacridone magenta, and burnt umber. I find that the umber and ultramarine is enough for that depth that I'm looking for. Incidentally, some of those branches can be drawn in either with a number 2 long filbert brush or this 1/4 inch bristle dagger. You'll now see a few of those lines coming through, which are giving the tree a bit more structure, indicating some branches cutting across some of those windows of distant mountain that we had achieved previously. And I even made a little bit of a stroke vertically towards the base of the tree, indicating where the trunk is going. Now let's just kick back a little bit, play a bit of that background music, and watch the painting unfold. Now I'm going to grab my long filbert number 2, mix up a bit of titanium white, ultramarine blue, and cobalt teal. I might even kick it with just a touch of burnt umber to achieve a slight dull gray. And here I'm going to reestablish some of those windows of sky showing through. Now before, we had some pretty diffused blended edges. I think this requires a bit more definition. This will allow the upper reaches of our tree to be a bit more crisp against that lighter sky. It'll define our tree some more using that negative space. Once again, just applying marks with just the very tips of the bristles is all we need to get that indication of detail. But you'll notice, for the most part, it's pretty suggestive. We're not spelling out anything with great detail and precise work with a zero-pointed round. What we're doing here is just suggesting some of those shapes, and by using that negative space, bringing these windows closer together, we can define and create some much finer marks. Now, using negative space goes so far to creating that sense of texture. This is important for the material of our pine tree. By paying attention to that reference material, we can hone in on the unique character of the pine. And it's locking it into place and establishing it a little bit more within this context, within our mountain landscape. Just like in the previous sitting, I pay attention to those distant colors beyond. So as I move down into the tree, I start to bring in a bit of that color that is matching that distant mountain. And speaking of distant mountain, this area needs a little bit more refinement. With my number 2 filbert brush, I start drawing across that slope, adjusting some of the shadows that have been cast across the snow. Here I'm just going to clean up a few of these edges and knock back a bit of the imprimatur that's showing through. As I kill some of the warmth with this cooler color, it pushes it a little further back into space. With the brush loaded with nearly pure white, I start to add in a few little accents of snow catching direct highlights. Now, even though this is a brighter tone, it's not going to come too far forward. It's the difference between shadow and highlight that brings things forward, and it's the dark tones that seem to travel further forward towards the viewer. So with this in mind, I keep my shadows here nice and light. But I can get away with some bright tone here, seeing as it's snow up here in the mountains. This will still recede, so long as those shadows in the mountain don't get too dark. And back here, towards the shaded side of the tree, we can increase our contrast, bringing some of these light highlights of snow into this area, further defining that edge. As I scan across the painting, I'm asking myself, what does this need to really drive the illusion? How can we create more of a sense of light and texture within our tree? It's time to apply some highlights to the tree. Now here, in some of those areas of highlight, it's still that dried layer from the previous sitting. Let's mix up now some Hansa yellow. We'll add to this some cobalt teal. I've got a little bit of medium on the brush. I'll flick in some of that royal sienna and white. Now this will be slightly lighter than the color we had achieved before. For coordination, I add just a touch of ultramarine blue, and for a bit of thickness and texture to my marks, I'll add in a touch of liquid impasto, making sure this is thoroughly mixed. And just a note on using those mediums, you want to make sure you mix that medium into the paint pretty thoroughly. You don't want any spots of goopy liquid without any paint in there. Get as thorough a mix as you can by rolling the brush on that palette several times. I'm going to apply a few of these accents of lighter color, and this is providing a bit more contrast with that underlying darker tone. Once again, just using the point end of my 1/4 inch bristle dagger brush is all I need for this sense of texture coming through. And I'm paying attention to the sizing and the spacing of some of those clumps that I can see in my reference material. We're suggesting pine needles here. We don't need to paint each and every pine needle for this to feel like a pine tree. We're going after the texture and the overall impression of the tree. You want your paintings to be able to read reasonably realistic from about 10 feet away. But part of the treat for the viewer, if you will, is when they get up close to it. When they're really studying your painting closely, they can appreciate the marks that you've made to achieve the illusion. This is one thing that I really love about painting. It's not about spelling things out with tiny little marks. It's about suggesting most of the time. I'm paying attention to the location of these highlights, making sure I don't get too far into the shadowed portion. Again, we want to try to achieve the form of the tree. So look very closely at the reference and see where those highlights occur. They taper off and they spread out a little bit more as we approach that shadow, and they're non-existent on that shadow portion of the tree. Now you might be wondering about the difference between warm and cool. I'll build a little bit of this dynamic into my color mixing. Some of the highlights in the previous session were slightly cool. This came from a bit more cobalt teal and ultramarine blue coming through. But now some of the highlights that I'm applying are shifting slightly warmer with more raw sienna and Hansa yellow coming through. And simultaneously, I'm getting a little bit lighter. This is by design. It's on purpose. I want there to be a point of difference between the marks that I'm making as I layer. It creates interest in the painting. Now that interest and dynamic surface, it comes about from contrast, be it a contrast of tone or value, so light to dark, or a contrast of temperature, warm to cool. Now you'll see here the two yellows that we have, the Hansa yellow and the raw sienna, are both pretty warm. We can cool that down, of course, with more ultramarine and cobalt teal. But I like having that relationship between warm and cool appearing in not only my shadows, but my highlights as well. Again, this provides some really nice interest in the painting surface. Now down here towards the base of my mountain, I decide to drop my tone a little bit, lower the value, make things a bit darker to bring the base of the mountain closer towards the viewer. But I've already established how dark I am here with the foreground tree, our pine tree, the subject, and so I'm staying well away from that tonal value. So somewhere between the tone that I had previously achieved and this foreground tree. Now, as long as some of these tree shadows that I'm painting now are slightly darker than that background, yet lighter than the tree, it'll hold its space somewhere out there in the distance. Again, that deep tone is what's going to allow our pine tree to come further forward. So if I got that dark tone just the same as the pine tree itself, guess what? It's going to bring these trees as far forward as our tree itself. We don't want to do that. We want to maintain that sense of depth and atmosphere. So I lighten things up with a bit of titanium white, and I have here in my mix ultramarine blue, cobalt teal, raw sienna, and a bit of burnt umber. One thing I'm doing here as I apply some of this darkness here to the base of the mountain is I'm breaking apart those strokes, rolling my brush and changing the direction and angle of that brush as it impacts the surface. This breaks up my marks a little bit more, creating a bit of interest. Now we've been hanging out here in the studio for a little bit more than an hour together, and you might have noticed my wall easel. I have an old French box easel that I've removed the legs from, and this clamps into my wall easel that you see here. I've built this wall easel over and over again in every studio that I've had. It's a French cleat system. It's very simple to make. And you'll even notice that my iPad fits on a little articulated arm that also clamps into one of these blocks. I keep my reference close at hand, and I like to keep mine on an iPad. That way I can zoom in and zoom out. This makes it really handy when you're working from photographic references. Now let's mix up a little bit of lighter color here using our 1/4 inch bristle dagger brush. Here we've got some raw sienna, burnt umber, titanium white, and a little bit of Hansa coming through, as well as plenty of ultramarine and cobalt teal. We're going to apply a few lighter green accents to these trees, but I don't want them too bright in terms of their green or too much chroma color coming through. The reason for this is the more intense that yellow in my green, the more it will come further forward. Now, like we were talking about with value, color has a similar relationship when it comes to depth. The brighter colors come closer towards the viewer. And there's something about yellow, orange, and red in particular that really does not do well over a vast distance. This is why distant, foliage-laden hills and mountains covered with forest and trees, this is why they start to shift blue and eventually shift to violet the further away from the viewer they are. Now, if we know this as a painter, then it makes good sense to knock those greens back. Now, if we were to get a little bit scientific here, what's happening is those red, orange, and yellow wavelengths of light are a little bit of a longer wavelength. Though they travel at the same speed as everything else in the visual spectrum, that longer wavelength is a little more readily scattered by dust, vapor, and atmosphere. This shifts to those distant colors, and they start to travel towards blue and violet. So having less of the yellow come through in our green means that we can have this recede. Now think about it this way. If I applied too much yellow back here by having that Hansa yellow, cobalt teal, and even phthalo green in my trees here at the distance, they're going to come all the way forward towards the viewer. The thing I love about painting is creating this illusion of three-dimensional depth and space within the two dimensions that we're given. It's all about creating that window into another world. And don't let anybody shame you for using photographic references. I think these can be really useful as tools, as visual aids when we're creating inspiring pictures. But here I just wanted to keep it very simple for you in this demonstration of just painting a tree. Yes, with a few extra techniques for you thrown in the mix. Now there's a little bit of grass up here, illuminated by the sun, and I know this grass is going to have some beautiful golden green quality to it, but I knock it back plenty. Another way to desaturate, simply by adding a touch of white. But another good way is to apply just a little bit of burnt umber to your mixes, especially when it comes to the distance. This will knock down that chroma or intensity of color, allowing you to create that depth. Now this here is a bit of a specialty brush. It's an old fan brush that I've hacked away at with a pair of scissors. It's very flexible here, but because the individual bristles are splayed out, it's great for grass texture. I'll use this here to flick upwards into the wet paint of that deep shadow of our pine tree, and now we can get strong contrast between these illuminated weeds and that deep shadow. I've applied a mix here of raw sienna, white, and a bit of Hansa yellow. Now you can overdo this technique. A little bit goes a long way. Remember, we're trying to be suggestive here. It's a painting after all, and not a photograph. I'll mix up onto my 1/4 inch bristle dagger brush a darker mix now to adjust some of the shadows of our eroded bank. This is burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and a little bit of that raw sienna. And I'll work along the edges of some of the furrows that have been eroded downwards. As I increase the contrast here, it's bringing out more of this texture. There is a slight green quality to this because of the nature of the bank itself. I'm seeing this in my reference, but I'm also picking up a little bit of that pine green that we had achieved previously. There's a bit of ultramarine coming through, and when it mixes in with that raw sienna, it creates a slight greenish tinge. But this is only helping me with that coordination between the bank and the tree itself. We'll go in and add a few more accents here. I'm using just the very ends of those bristles to create a bit of character going over the top of that dried layer that we had achieved previously. Now, because that underlying layer had a little bit of tooth to it, this was texture that was part of that initial block-in with the bristle brushes and a touch of that liquid impasto medium. As the brush draws lightly across the surface, it picks up some of the high points in that texture and creates even more of a natural eroded look to this bank. So I'm using the texture of the paint itself and the effects of how it dries to create more of an illusion here with this foreground. Again, this reads best when you step back a little bit, but you're seeing it up close and personal here in this painting. Let's carry over to this side now with the same technique, and I want to deepen this shadow over on the left-hand edge. I really love some of this texture that I see in my reference material. Ultramarine blue and burnt umber forms the basis of this mix. Remember, you want to add 1 part medium to those 3 parts paint as you go along. With just a few accents of our shadows applied, we're starting to get that look and character of our eroded bank. The darker I make some of these shadows, it will help it come a bit further forward. But to really bring that contrast and establish our foreground, we're going to need some highlights. And I'll apply these once I've mixed in there some of my shadows. I'll go ahead and get some more paint out on that brush and draw some furrows that travel downwards and just break up that front surface a bit more before getting into those lighter marks. Now, I said at the beginning, you want to save your tonal best for last. This is pretty close to it with raw sienna, a bit of burnt umber, titanium white, and some liquid impasto medium. I'm going to roll this onto the brush, and I'm going to mix up some really thick paint here. I've even added just a touch of Hansa yellow. Now, nothing reflects light back to the viewer as thick, lighter value paint. This is how I use texture strategically to create that illusion of light within the scene. And you can see, because we were relatively muted or darker with our initial block-in, how this contrast starts to create an effect. If I was to apply these lighter marks over a tone or a value that was exactly the same as what I'm applying now, you wouldn't actually be able to see it. There would be no contrast. So generally, my block ends are slightly darker than the highlights and details that I'm going to be adding over the top. You always want to have a little bit of room to travel with your paintings. Have another couple of moves that you can make to create that sense of texture and that sense of form bathed in light. Now I've loaded the brush with just the blade edge of that 1/4 inch bristle dagger, and I'm drawing this down following some of those grooves and texture in this eroded bank. As the light strikes these bright, thick highlights, it reflects back to that viewer, and they're standing proud of some of those dark shadows. I'm careful not to overdo it, again trying to be as suggestive as possible. You can really see here how that bank is starting to come further and further forward towards the viewer. It's time to apply a few more accents with our old fan brush. Let's go ahead and mix up some of those grass notes once more and work around some of these shadows that we had applied, as well as some of those highlights. Now that we have that underlying structure, we can go ahead and plant a few weeds around the place. Now this fan brush is so handy. Previously we'd used a very light color. Here this one is slightly darker. It's burnt umber, ultramarine blue, a bit of cobalt teal, and raw sienna. But I'll mix in some of those highlight colors that we were applying before of those lighter patches of dirt on our eroded bank. I'm brushing across our edge, breaking it up slightly, dragging some of that lighter color into the background, giving it a bit more contrast. We'll break up this edge over on the top left and continue to add some of those lighter marks of grass along the top of our bank. Finally, I'll adjust some of those shadows, apply a few little dark marks here and there to just make sure we have the right sculptural feel in our bank. And the last little touch is to sign the painting. And there you have it. We're finished with our little pine tree study. I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration as much as I've enjoyed spending this time with you here in the studio. Now, let's have a little bit of a chat and a wrap up. Well, I really hope you've enjoyed this demonstration and you've learned something. Maybe you've come away with a technique or two. If you have, just imagine on what we're going to learn together in the studio as we break down several more tree species. In part 1 of our full tree painting course, we're going to be painting a willow. We're going to also be painting a gum tree. I've got a really cool scene of some autumn trees lining a little country lane. This one's called Ardrossan Street, inspired by a town that I used to live in. And I also have this demonstration of some winter trees with some bare branches. These are larch. And this painting here is called Larch Thicket. And they can be seen just near the Otago Dam in the South Island of New Zealand. And they're above that frozen Otago Dam. It's a really unique winter scene. But here, the first part of our tree course, you can see there's a bit of variety. And I'm also going to share with you some detail techniques for how to achieve specific foliage, branch textures, bark textures, and much, much more. So I really hope you join us for the full course, but I want to thank you for downloading this course right now, this first module, Painting a Pine Tree. Thank you for spending this time with me here in the studio, and I hope we meet again very, very soon. Until then, my friend, happy painting.